When you remove every single daily responsibility from a person's life for 4 straight months, their brain doesn't just relax, it panics. It desperately starts creating artificial problems just to feel something. That is exactly how you end up with highly educated professionals orchestrating ruthless black market lending networks over a missing thriller novel. 1. Exactly 42 days into a 115-day global circumnavigation, a 40-year-old solo traveler named Marcus began constructing a subtle, passive-aggressive fortress out of consumer electronics. Marcus, a remote software developer from Helsinki, had claimed a specific circular table in the corner of the ship's forward observation lounge on embarkation day. He did not ask permission or speak to the crew about this arrangement. He simply established ownership through the relentless daily deployment of a mechanical keyboard, a wireless mouse, 2 heavily stickered thermoses, and a noise-canceling headset placed precisely at the same angle every morning at 8:15. In the behavioral psychology of closed environments, this is a thoroughly documented phenomenon. When all your basic survival needs are met and you no longer have to worry about cooking, commuting, or maintaining a home, your brain desperately manufactures stakes, attaching your entire sense of status and stability to a 4x4 square of generic maritime carpeting. Consider how intensely you might guard an unassigned, but spiritually yours, desk at a corporate office, and then multiply that defensive instinct by 2 straight months adrift on the Pacific Ocean. By day 30, the elderly crew's demographic subconsciously accepted this as Marcus's sovereign territory, instinctively parting around his table as if it emitted low-level radiation. The system was flawless until the ship docked in Singapore on day 45, picking up 300 segment cruisers who were only joining for a 2-week tropical leg. These people were entirely blind to the unwritten indigenous laws. On their first morning at sea, a cheerful Australian couple in their 60s waltzed into the lounge, moved Marcus's headset 3 inches to the left, and sat down at his table to play a game of gin rummy. When Marcus arrived from the buffet holding a plate of melon, he didn't raise his voice or call security. According to the lounge bartender who watched the entire event unfold, Marcus simply walked up to the table, stood exactly 6 inches from the Australian man's right shoulder, and stared entirely unblinking at the ace of spades in the man's hand. He did not speak. He just stood there, chewing a piece of cantaloupe with aggressive, rhythmic precision, radiating the pure, focused hostility of a territorial apex predator. The tension in the lounge spiked so sharply that an elderly woman doing a crossword puzzle 2 tables away reportedly packed up her things and left the room. After exactly 9 minutes of this silent, heavy-breathing vigil, the Australian couple, deeply unnerved by the towering Finnish man looming silently over their card game, abandoned the hand and fled to the pool deck, leaving Marcus to wipe down the veneer surface with an antibacterial wipe and resume his coding, utterly unfazed by the fact that he had just defended a piece of public furniture with the intensity of a military border dispute. 2. On a standard 7-day vacation, the ship's library is a quiet place where people browse paperback novels and occasionally check their emails. But on a 120-day global circumnavigation, the library transforms into an arena of intense social friction, usually centered around a single piece of communal cardboard. To keep long-term guests occupied, the entertainment staff will often lay out a massive, highly complex jigsaw puzzle on a central table. It is intended to be a relaxing, collaborative activity. However, in prolonged isolation, the human brain desperately craves a sense of tangible accomplishment. A 10,000-piece puzzle provides a measurable goal, which is why retirees on world cruises often treat the completion of a Bavarian castle landscape with the severe dedication of a municipal infrastructure project. The dispute on this particular sailing emerged around day 40, splitting the participants into 2 distinct, unyielding factions based entirely on their sleep schedules. First, there was the morning crew, led by Evelyn, a 72-year-old retired botanist who arrived at the library precisely at 6 in the morning with a cup of Earl Grey tea. Evelyn and her group preferred a methodical, highly organized approach, sorting pieces by exact color gradients into dozens of small paper cups. Then, there was the evening crew, led by Thomas, a 68-year-old former logistics manager who arrived at 10 at night with a snifter of cognac. Thomas's group was chaotic. preferring to force pieces together through trial and error, often leaving sections of the sky looking slightly warped. The tension began when Evelyn noticed that Thomas's group was focusing entirely on the fun parts of the puzzle, the castle spires and the horses, while leaving the tedious, identical blue sky pieces for her morning group to endure. Believing this to be a profound breach of maritime etiquette, Evelyn decided to take control of the supply chain. Instead of assembling the castle spires, she began quietly pocketing the most crucial pieces of the architecture. Before leaving for breakfast, she would slip handfuls of cardboard into the pages of an untouched encyclopedia volume on the bottom shelf of the reference section, ensuring her group could retrieve them and experience the satisfaction of placing them the next day. This action fundamentally altered the social ecosystem of the library. Thomas, quickly realizing that the primary subjects of the puzzle were mysteriously vanishing overnight, assumed the morning crew was hoarding them. In retaliation, he instructed the evening crew to start hiding all the edge pieces and the unique landscape features inside the decorative porcelain vases lining the windowsills. By day 70, the actual puzzle on the table had seen zero progress for 3 weeks. No one was actually assembling the picture anymore. They were simply engaged in a silent, high-stakes redistribution of cardboard. Passengers were actively carrying sections of the Bavarian Alps in their cardigans to the dining room to protect their territory. It was a masterpiece of passive stubbornness, culminating on day 92 when the puzzle was finally, miraculously, brought together, leaving exactly one piece missing right in the center of the castle door. Evelyn and Thomas were both standing at the table, staring at each other in total silence. Evelyn assumed Thomas was withholding it out of spite. Thomas assumed Evelyn was keeping it to claim the final victory. The tension was palpable, yet neither was willing to admit to their 3-month hoarding scheme. The entire situation was resolved by Leo, a 28-year-old solo traveler and graphic designer who had never once participated in the puzzle. On the very first day of the cruise, 3 months prior, Leo had walked through the library, noticed a single loose piece on the floor near a chair, picked it up, dropped it into his jacket pocket, and entirely forgot about it. Now, returning from a chilly port excursion in New Zealand, he reached into that same jacket to find his cabin key, felt the piece of cardboard, and walked into the library. Without speaking to either of the stunned factions, Leo stepped up to the table, placed the missing piece perfectly into the center of the castle door, nodded once, and said, "Looks good." He then walked out to get a sandwich from the buffet, completely unaware that he had just concluded a 3-month sociological dispute between 30 deeply invested retirees. 3. If you wander into the self-service laundry room on Deck 7 at precisely 2 in the afternoon, you will witness a level of unyielding bureaucracy usually reserved for a municipal tax audit. The laundry room on a world cruise is a rigid ecosystem where the polite veneer of vacationing dissolves into a strict, unspoken scheduling regime over 4 heavy-duty washing machines. Frau Müller, a 71-year-old passenger from Munich, operated in this space not as a guest, but as an unforgiving timekeeper. She did not bring a book to read while her clothes washed. She brought a digital stopwatch on a neon green lanyard. Frau Müller would sit rigidly in the single plastic chair facing the machines, and whenever a stranger loaded their laundry, she would press the start button on her timer the exact second they closed the door. The absolute, unbending rule of the maritime laundry room is that you must be present when your cycle ends, but Frau Müller removed all margins for human error. One Tuesday, exactly 40 seconds after machine number 3 beeped its completion tune, the owner, a young woman from Canada, was nowhere to be seen. Frau Müller did not hesitate. She stood up, opened the machine, and began extracting the wet clothing with a pair of stainless steel barbecue tongs she had brought exclusively for this purpose, refusing to touch another person's garments with her bare hands. She systematically dropped soaking wet gym shirts, running shorts, and expensive athletic wear into a tangled pile on the folding counter, just as the Canadian woman walked through the door. When the younger woman gasped and loudly demanded to know why a stranger was using kitchen utensils to handle her workout clothes, Frau Müller didn't yell or argue. She simply tapped the glowing screen of her stopwatch, looked the woman dead in the eye, and calmly stated that 28 minutes was a contract, and the contract had been breached. 4. To understand the sheer psychological toll of living on a ship for 3 consecutive months, you only need to look at the eerie, absolute silence of the schooner bar on day 84, where a pristine, untouched bowl of mixed nuts sits on a table surrounded entirely by empty chairs. 2 days prior, this room had been the site of a vibrant, loud trivia competition, but it had since been subjected to a coordinated campaign of social friction between two deeply incompatible demographics. There is a recognized breaking point on a world cruise where the permanent passengers stop viewing the ship as a hospitality venue and begin treating it as an exclusive, heavily guarded residential community. The outside world fades, and the daily trivia schedule becomes their actual religion. The tension ignited when the vessel stopped in Dubai to embark 200 short-term guests, people who had paid for a fast-paced, high-energy 10-day holiday. These newcomers boarded wearing vibrant floral shirts and a desperate, frantic need to consume unlimited cocktails, operating in peak vacation mode. The world cruisers, easily identifiable by their faded lanyards, beige cardigans, and the exhausted stares of people who have complained about the buffet layout for 80 consecutive days, viewed them as an intrusive element that did not understand the sacred rhythm of the ship. The clash occurred during the afternoon progressive trivia, a fiercely audited academic decathlon where veteran teams maintained meticulous spreadsheets of their cumulative scores. When a group of 6 sunburned newcomers joined the game, ordered a round of loud tequila shots, and high-fived every time they guessed a correct answer, the veterans did not complain to the staff. Instead, the temporary community activated a hive mind response. 4 different teams of elderly world cruisers simultaneously orchestrated an atmosphere of pure, suffocating discomfort. Whenever the newcomers laughed, 24 veterans would instantly stop writing, turn in their chairs, and stare at the newcomers with dead, unblinking expressions until the laughter nervously died out. When the trivia host read a history question, the veterans began loudly whispering the wrong answers just loud enough to confuse the newcomers, creating a wall of strategic disinformation. At the height of the tension, a newcomer accidentally dropped a cocktail napkin on the floor. A 70-year-old veteran instantly stood up, retrieved the napkin, walked it over to the man's table, and placed it exactly in the center of his coaster without breaking eye contact or speaking a single syllable. The sheer weight of the passive tension was so suffocating that by the next afternoon, the new passengers had entirely abandoned the indoor lounges, retreating to the upper pool decks to drink in peace. The veterans successfully reclaimed their territory, sitting in victorious, dead silence, sipping room-temperature tap water, and guarding their trivia supremacy in a completely empty room. 5. At 3:15 in the morning, entirely bathed in the neon glow of the closed 24-hour pizzeria, a 35-year-old passenger named Clara sat completely alone, aggressively tearing into a plain, untoasted bagel with the frantic energy of a starving woman. If you had seen her, you might have assumed she was recovering from a terrible night at the casino, but Clara's exhaustion was purely self-inflicted. It was day 60 of a 90-day South Pacific sailing, and Clara was trapped in a dietary prison of her own design. On embarkation day, seeking a logistical shortcut, Clara had noticed that guests with dietary restrictions received their custom plates instantly, skipping the standard 20-minute wait in the main dining room. She promptly and falsely informed her head waiter that she had a severe, non-negotiable intolerance to gluten. For the first 2 weeks, it was a triumph of maritime espionage. Clara received expedited meals while her tablemates waited for their appetizers. But she failed to account for the sheer dedication of a luxury cruise culinary team. The pastry chefs, operating at peak efficiency, began producing baskets of fresh, warm, artisanal sourdough and golden croissants for her table every single night. Taking her fabricated allergy with absolute professional seriousness, the waiters would preemptively remove the bread basket from her reach before she even sat down, replacing it with a single, dense, vacuum-sealed rice cracker. Because the human ego will often choose sustained misery over public embarrassment, Clara could not suddenly declare herself miraculously cured without admitting she had lied to a staff of 30 people for 2 months. Instead, she spent the remaining 30 days sneaking out of her cabin in the dead of night, wearing sunglasses in total darkness just to rapidly consume carbohydrates near the buffet elevators before retreating to bed, utterly defeated by the impeccable service she had tried to manipulate. 6. On any standard 7-day vacation, the ship's guest lecturer is usually a mildly entertaining diversion on a rainy afternoon, speaking to a half-empty theater about local geology or dolphins. But on a 120-day world cruise, the 10 o'clock morning enrichment lecture becomes a structural pillar of the daily schedule. And for a specific type of passenger, it transforms into an arena for intellectual blood sport. Enter Julian, a 71-year-old retired orthodontist from Toronto. Julian fancied himself a fiercely rigorous amateur maritime historian, and he approached the ship's scheduled lectures with the hostile, scrutinizing energy of a Supreme Court justice during a cross-examination. The cruise line had hired a mild-mannered, 65-year-old retired academic named Dr. Sterling to deliver 30 PowerPoint presentations on naval history in exchange for a complimentary cabin. Dr. Sterling assumed he would be softly speaking to sleepy retirees, digesting their buffet breakfasts. He did not anticipate Julian. The psychological dynamic of the theater shifted entirely on day 14. During a slide about the Spanish Armada, Julian, sitting dead center in the front row, loudly cleared his throat, stood up, and corrected Dr. Sterling on the exact cargo tonnage of a 16th-century galleon. Dr. Sterling, caught off guard by the interruption, politely conceded the point. That was his fatal mistake. For Julian, there was now blood in the water. By day 25, Julian was no longer just asking aggressive questions at the end of the session. He began bringing his own personal, high-powered red laser pointer to the theater, using it from his seat to physically circle perceived geographical inaccuracies on the professor's projected maps while the man was mid-sentence. The sheer audacity of a passenger actively disrupting a hired professional should have resulted in a swift ban from the theater. But something fascinating happened instead. The audience size began to double. The passengers weren't coming for the history of the East India Company. They were coming for the gladiatorial combat. By day 40, Julian had essentially weaponized the ship's library. He purchased an unlimited satellite internet package, spent his evenings fact-checking the upcoming lecture topics, and utilized the library's printer to produce his own supplemental errata sheets. He would stand by the theater doors at 9:45 in the morning, handing out his photocopied corrections to the incoming crowd, like a union organizer distributing pamphlets. Social dynamics in enclosed spaces often dictate that crowds will flock to conflict simply to alleviate the crushing monotony of routine. The passengers began treating Julian like a rogue anti-hero, whispering excitedly when he raised his hand. Dr. Sterling, meanwhile, was visibly deteriorating, sweating heavily during his introductions, and nervously glancing at Julian before stating any specific historical date. The climax of this bizarre academic siege arrived on day 60, when the ship docked in Sydney. Dr. Sterling's contract covered only the first half of the world cruise, and he happily disembarked, fleeing the vessel with his luggage and his shattered academic confidence. Julian, completely drunk on his own perceived popularity, marched directly to the cruise director's desk. He confidently announced that since he had proven himself to be the superior historian, he was volunteering to deliver the 10 o'clock lectures for the remaining 2 months of the voyage. The cruise director, an expert in de-escalating unearned passenger confidence, politely explained that insurance liabilities prevented him from using the main stage, but offered Julian a daily slot in Conference Room C, a windowless card room on Deck 3. Julian excitedly accepted. He spent 48 straight hours in his cabin, meticulously designing a masterful 90-minute presentation on the Battle of Midway. The next morning at exactly 10 o'clock, Julian stood proudly behind the podium in Conference Room C, wearing a tailored suit, clutching his laser pointer, and waiting for his adoring public to arrive. Out of the 300 people who had gleefully watched him in the main theater, exactly 3 showed up. 2 of them were a confused elderly couple looking for the intermediate Sudoku meetup, and the third was a man who immediately sat in the back row, put on an eye mask, and fell asleep. The twist was a fascinating lesson in the psychology of crowd behavior. The passengers had absolutely no genuine interest in naval history, and they certainly didn't care about Julian's intellect. They had simply been showing up for the daytime soap opera. Without the entertaining spectacle of an unscripted, highly polite feud playing out on stage, the appeal evaporated entirely. Julian wasn't a celebrated scholar leading an academic renaissance. He was just a man in a suit talking to an empty windowless card room, instantly irrelevant the moment the dramatic conflict disappeared. 7. Consider the absolute confidence required to look at a daily schedule delivered to your cabin, read the bold print stating that clocks must be moved forward by 1 hour, and decide that the ship's captain is simply incorrect. The international dateline and the constant shifting of time zones present a unique psychological test for long-term travelers. Over a 4-month circumnavigation, a ship will adjust its clock so frequently that time becomes a fluid, abstract concept. Most people simply turn the dial on their watches and move on with their lives. Winston, a 58-year-old retired structural engineer from Texas, did not. Winston wore a vintage mechanical Swiss chronometer that he had perfectly calibrated to Central Standard Time before leaving Houston, and he viewed any alteration of its hands as a compromise of his personal integrity. On day 12, Winston declared that ship time was a logistical illusion. He determined he would live his entire 110-day vacation strictly on Houston time, utilizing a heavily highlighted laminated spreadsheet he carried in his breast pocket to mathematically convert his schedule. This system worked passably well in the Caribbean, but as the ship pushed deep into the South Pacific, the time difference stretched to 16 hours, creating a massive, unsolvable rift in reality. Winston's extreme temporal stubbornness culminated on formal night during the crossing to New Zealand. While 2,000 passengers were sleeping in their cabins at 4 in the morning, Winston put on a full tailored tuxedo, sprayed himself with cologne, and walked confidently down to the main dining room, fully expecting to be served a medium-rare filet mignon. He found the massive double doors locked, the lights dimmed, and a crew of night cleaners running industrial vacuums over the carpets. Rather than checking the wall clock in the atrium, Winston simply assumed the ship was running late. He pulled up a velvet chair in the empty lobby, crossed his legs, and waited in total silence for 2 hours. It wasn't until 6:30 in the morning, when a group of passengers in sweatpants and orthopedic shoes began lining up for the early bird buffet breakfast, that Winston realized he was sitting in a tuxedo next to people waiting for scrambled eggs. His absolute refusal to turn a tiny metal dial half an inch to the right had completely isolated him in his own private time zone, leaving him to eat a croissant in formal wear while the sun slowly rose over the Pacific. 8. If you stand behind the glowing coin pusher machine in the ship's casino and watch a grown man carefully calculate the exact retraction speed of a mechanical shelf, you are witnessing the precise moment when money loses its fundamental utility. In a standard land-based casino, people gamble in the hopes of altering their financial reality. On a luxury world cruise, where the passengers have already spent the equivalent of a suburban mortgage just to get on board, they gamble to manufacture a sense of risk in an entirely risk-free environment. Kenji, a 50-year-old logistics director from Tokyo, had fallen into a deep, intense obsession with this specific machine. The premise was simple: drop quarters down a pegboard to push a cascading pile of coins off a ledge. Sitting precariously on the very edge of this metallic cliff was the grand prize: a molded plastic keychain shaped like the ship's funnel, an item with an estimated wholesale value of roughly 80 cents. Kenji, a man who managed complex international supply chains for a living, approached this keychain with the severe analytical focus of a corporate merger. Every evening after dinner, he would stand at the glass perfectly still, charting the drop angle of the tokens. He knew the math was terrible. He knew the machine was rigged. But he had fallen victim to the purest form of the sunk cost fallacy, completely divorcing the perceived value of the prize from its actual monetary worth. By day 50, Kenji had fed nearly $700 in quarters into the machine. He wasn't even attempting to win the cascading coins anymore. He just wanted the plastic funnel. He began skipping the evening theater shows to guard the machine, terrified that a casual passenger walking past might drop a single token and reap the reward of his 3 weeks of structural preparation. Finally, on a Tuesday evening off the coast of Fiji, Kenji dropped a coin perfectly through the center slot. It hit the pile, the shelf pushed forward, and the plastic keychain tumbled down the chute with a dull, hollow thud. Kenji calmly retrieved it, placed it carefully in the breast pocket of his jacket, walked directly to the guest services desk, and politely asked the clerk for a small piece of velvet rope so he could properly display it on his cabin desk. He had spent the equivalent of a domestic flight on a piece of injected molded plastic, simply to prove to a piece of arcade equipment that he was the superior intellectual force. 9. In an environment completely devoid of personal responsibility, generating bureaucratic friction often becomes a subconscious substitute for meaningful social interaction. By the second month of a world cruise, the guest services desk ceases to be an information center and transforms into a psychological support clinic for people who simply miss the structure of having a daily problem. Consider Ingrid, a 68-year-old retired architect from Stockholm. Exactly 30 days into the voyage, Ingrid developed a severe fixation on her cabin's thermostat. Every single afternoon at precisely 3:15, she would approach the front desk, wait patiently in line, and formally complain to the clerk that her room was exactly 1 degree too warm. During the first week, the engineering team visited her cabin 4 times, deploying digital thermometers to prove the climate control was functioning flawlessly. But Ingrid refused to accept the data. The situation was entirely resolved not by mechanics, but by a brilliant, 24-year-old hospitality clerk from the Philippines who understood human nature. On day 38, when Ingrid arrived for her daily complaint, the clerk didn't call maintenance. He simply looked at his computer screen, nodded with deep sympathy, furiously typed on his keyboard for 10 seconds, and firmly stated, "I have overridden the mainframe and adjusted it manually for you, ma'am." Ingrid smiled, thanked him profusely, and left. From that day forward, for the next 70 days of the voyage, Ingrid arrived at 3:15. The clerk typed on an entirely disconnected keyboard screen, and Ingrid left completely satisfied. She didn't actually want the temperature changed, she just desperately craved the comforting rhythm of a daily municipal transaction. 10. The fitness center on a megaship is usually a ghost town by dinner, but at 6 in the morning it becomes an arena of intense, unspoken territorial disputes. On a 120-day sailing, the ship's gym featured exactly 2 functional rowing machines, and access was governed by a simple paper clipboard left on the front desk by the fitness instructor every morning. You write your name, you get your 30-minute slot. This system worked perfectly until a 60-year-old retired engineer from Munich named Klaus and a 55-year-old dentist from Perth named Barbara both decided they absolutely required the premium 7 o'clock rowing slot. The escalation was purely temporal. On day 14, Klaus arrived at 5:50 in the morning to sign the sheet first. The next day, Barbara arrived at 5:45. Recognizing the challenge, Klaus adjusted his alarm and arrived at 5:30. Behavioral economists refer to this as a zero-sum game, where one person's gain is strictly balanced by another's loss. But in a closed leisure environment, the commitment to winning quickly overrides basic logic. Neither of them ever spoke to each other about the schedule. They simply let their alarms do the talking. By day 40, this silent standoff had completely spiraled out of control. The fitness instructor arrived at 5 in the morning to unlock the glass doors, only to find Klaus and Barbara already standing in the dark hallway, fully dressed in high-performance athletic gear, staring blankly at the ocean through the corridor windows. They had both been standing there since 4:15 in the morning, sacrificing 3 hours of premium vacation sleep, simply to guard a plastic clipboard that had not even been set out yet. The utter absurdity of 2 highly educated adults ruining their own circadian rhythms over a rowing machine forced the cruise director to intervene. On day 42, the paper clipboard was permanently abolished, replaced by a digital booking app on the ship's intranet that unlocked at exactly midnight. Instead of resolving the issue, it simply shifted the obsession. For the remainder of the 3-month voyage, Klaus and Barbara stopped waking up early, and instead sat rigidly in their respective cabins at 11:59 at night, furiously tapping their digital tablets in the dark, locked in a permanent high-speed digital standoff. 11. A unique form of psychological gridlock occurs inside the glass elevators of a large vessel around the 3-month mark, driven entirely by a bizarre, unspoken status game. One afternoon on Deck 4, an elegant 70-year-old Italian gentleman named Marco stepped into an upward-bound elevator, gripped the brass handrail, and absolutely refused to press a floor button, projecting the aura of a man who naturally expects others to operate machinery for him. Before the doors closed, a 50-something Canadian man wearing a golf shirt stepped in, stood in the opposite corner, and also entirely refused to press a button, seemingly out of a stubborn principle that he shouldn't have to reveal his destination first. Because neither man was willing to admit a logistical error or speak to a stranger, A silent, absolute battle of wills commenced in a 6x6 glass box. The elevator was called to Deck 9 by an outside passenger who got on, pressed Deck 12, and got off, leaving Marco and the Canadian man to ride upward in total silence. The elevator was then called down to Deck 3. They both rode it down, staring blankly at the ocean view. For a fully documented 45 minutes, these two grown men simply rode the elevator up and down the height of the ship, acting completely unbothered, sacrificing a significant portion of their afternoon entirely to avoid a 10-second interaction, perfectly illustrating how the temporary anonymity of a cruise allows perfectly rational adults to operate with the conflict resolution skills of a stubborn toddler. 12. In a post-scarcity environment where food is unlimited and time is abundant, the human brain will artificially manufacture scarcity just to experience the thrill of the hunt. The ship's library on a world cruise does not receive new inventory. Whatever is placed on the shelves in January must last until May. On embarkation day, the cruise line had generously provided exactly one hardcover copy of a highly anticipated 800-page thriller by a famous mystery author. By day 2, the book had vanished. The official sign-out sheet remained entirely blank. Enter Helen, a 52-year-old former corporate auditor from Chicago. Helen had boarded the ship with the express intention of reading that specific novel, and when she realized it was missing, her professional instincts activated. She correctly deduced that the book had fallen into the ship's clandestine lending network, a shadow system where highly coveted reading material is passed directly from cabin to cabin, bypassing the official 2-week return rule entirely. Helen made it her absolute mission to intercept the novel. She began her investigation on the upper pool deck, utilizing her auditing skills to scan the sun loungers for the book's distinctive neon yellow spine. After 4 days of surveillance, she spotted a woman in a floral swimsuit slipping a thick, yellow-spined book into a beach tote. Helen casually approached the lounger, struck up a polite conversation about the weather, and casually asked how the novel was. The woman looked at Helen, tightened her grip on the tote bag, and whispered that there was an informal 14-person waitlist managed entirely through a private WhatsApp group, and Helen was not on it. Refusing to be defeated by a digital waitlist, Helen decided to disrupt the supply chain. She spent a week mapping the social connections of the woman in the swimsuit, discovering that the book was scheduled to be handed off during the afternoon trivia session in the schooner bar. Helen orchestrated an interception by utilizing the ship's other major black market currency, liquid vanilla coffee creamer, a highly sought-after commodity the buffet had run out of on day 30. Helen had hoarded 3 unopened bottles in her cabin mini-fridge. During the trivia intermission, she cornered the next reader on the waitlist, a retired teacher from Boston, and proposed a direct trade. 1 pristine bottle of vanilla creamer for 48 hours of unrestricted access to the thriller. The teacher, desperate for a decent cup of coffee, accepted the bribe. Helen rushed the book back to her cabin, locked the door, and spent the next 2 days reading at a frantic pace, ignoring the ocean views, skipping the evening shows, and ordering room service just to maintain her focus. The story was brilliant. The tension was masterful. She reached page 790 out of 800, eagerly turned the page to discover the identity of the culprit, and found absolute nothingness. Pages 791 through 800 had been entirely physically torn out of the binding. Written in blue ballpoint pen on the inside of the back cover was a hastily scribbled note. Dropped it in the hot tub. Ruined the ending. The butler did it. Sorry. The absolute devastation of investing 3 weeks of detective work, a highly valuable bottle of smuggled dairy product, and 2 days of intense reading, only to have the climax ruined by a careless stranger, broke Helen's spirit. But she was an auditor, and she could not let an accounting error stand. She took a photograph of the blue handwriting in the back of the book and spent the next 5 evenings walking through the lounges, casually peering over shoulders as passengers filled out their daily trivia scorecards, cross-referencing the unique loop of the letter Y in the apology note. On day 62, she found a perfect match. It was a man named Arthur, sitting quietly in the corner of the pub. Helen didn't yell. She didn't cause a scene. She simply walked up to his table, placed the mutilated neon yellow hardcover directly on top of his pint of beer, and leaned in close. Without raising her voice, she demanded that Arthur orally dictate the exact missing 10 pages of the complex thriller from his memory. Because Arthur had actually read the ending before dropping it, and because he was deeply intimidated by Helen's sudden, quiet intensity, he spent the next 20 minutes sitting in the pub, nervously summarizing the intricate climax of a best-selling novel to an absolutely silent, unblinking woman from Chicago, proving that while you can hide from the ship's librarian, you can never escape the investigative reach of a frustrated reader. The ocean strips away the value of money, leaving only social leverage and pure stubbornness. Have you ever seen someone lose their grip on reality over something as petty as a pool chair or an elevator button? Tell me the story in the comments. Subscribe for more documented case studies on human behavior, because the best psychology lessons happen entirely at sea.